So recently there was the first big Regulation I tournament, which was the Victory Road April Challenge. So this tournament will be a great indicator of what the Regulation I metagame is likely to look like. But firstly, I wanted to look at the usage stats. So as we see with the restricted pairings, most popular being Calyrex, Shadow and Zamazenta. That shouldn't really be much of a shock to people, they just seem to complement each other quite well. You have a very powerful special attacking restricted paired with a very powerful physical attacking one. Zamazenta hits all the dark types and normal types that Astral Barrage can't hit for super effective. Whilst Calyrex Shadow gets to hit the ghost types that Zamazenta can't hit, Wide Guard on Zamazenta is also very good at supporting Calyrex Shadow, especially in the mirror. And it gives you two very fast restricteds, Calyrex Shadow being the fastest, and Zamazenta still being very fast. And we see that its usage actually went up from day 1 to day 2, so even though it was the most popular, it still performed really well. And then next is Calyrex Ice Miraidon, which I think people also expected that restricted pairing to be very popular. They basically cover each other offensively very well. Ice and Electric is one of the best offensive type combinations in the game because it lets you hit every single other type for super effective damage, and a lot of the things that resist one are going to be weak to the other. For example, grass can resist electric, but then it's weak to ice. Water resists ice, but then it's weak to electric. And they also work quite well because they both have similar partners that they want to be used with. Iron Hands being a big one, it's very good as a trick room sweeper, especially in electric terrain. Electric terrain also stops Amoonguss from sporing you, which a lot of the time is going to cause Calyrex Ice a lot of issues. In matchups where it wants to be working in trick room, Amoonguss can put a stop to that, but electric terrain means that Amoonguss is no longer an issue. They also both work fairly well with Farigiraf as another trick room setter to support Calyrex Ice, but also priority blocking for both. And similarly to Zamazenta Calyrex Shadow, we're seeing a very powerful physical restricted paired with a very powerful special one. This time the special one tends to use single target moves, and then the physical one tends to use spread moves. But Miraidon can still use Dazzling Gleam as a spread move. And we saw that the usage went up a bit between the 2 days, so not as successful as Calyrex Shadow and Zamazenta, but still very good. And third, we see Calyrex Shadow and Koraidon. And I'm a bit surprised to see this at third, but if I was going to be playing this tournament, this is the combination I think I would have tried to use. It's a very similar idea to Calyrex Zamazenta, but Koraidon makes it a much more offensive version of this. You lose the Wide Guard of Zamazenta, but instead you get Sun and you just have a much more powerful restricted. I also feel like this duo should have a pretty good matchup into Zamazenta Calyrex Shadow, as Koraidon beats Zamazenta, but losing the Wide Guard might actually be really important in that matchup, so I'm not so sure that it is a good matchup into that. But the same with Zamazenta, Koraidon hits the normal types and the dark types that Calyrex Shadow doesn't hit. And then in fourth we've got Swordfish, which is Kyogre and Zacian. Now this was probably the most popular restricted pairing in 2022, and they cover each other fairly well. Zacian struggles to hit fire types because its main stabs are fairy and steel, and Kyogre is obviously very good into fire types. Zacian can also hit things like Raging Bolt for a lot of damage, and Miraidon, which Kyogre struggles with, and it is very strong into Rillaboom, as Rillaboom can't really hit it, which is another thing that Kyogre struggles with. But we saw that its usage actually went down, so not performing as well, but I'd expect as the format to go on, this restricted pairing to get a lot better. I think because people haven't really used Zacian in a while, they're probably out of practice using it, so not sure how to build it. But the more that Reg I goes on, I think that Zacian is going to become a lot better, especially with Kyogre, when people understand how to build around it more. And then fifth is Lunala Koraidon, which was a pairing I'd never really thought of. I'm not really sure why this is Lunala's most popular partner. I guess for similar reasons as with Cali Shadow, it threatens the dark types that Lunala doesn't really want to face. It also threatens Rillaboom, which Lunala doesn't really like, especially if it's like a Psy Spam Lunala team. But as we can see here, there's actually 0 in day 2, so not performing very well at all. And then we've got Cali Shadow and Miraidon. That did okay, it's just 2 very fast, powerful special restricteds. There's a very interesting Calyrex Shadow Miraidon team that we are going to be talking about because it got 2nd place. Then we've got Zacian Miraidon, just a very powerful physical restricted, very powerful special restricted. None made day 2, so didn't perform very well. And then we've got Calyrex Shadow and Terapagos, which went from 3.4% usage to 11% usage in day 2, so performing very well. And this is the only Terapagos in the top 10 of restricted pairings, which I find a bit surprising. I thought Terapagos would be very good. I feel like it should be used with Zamazenta probably, but it seemed to have done well with Calyrex Shadow. And most of these Terrapagoses tended to be more of a setup one, so probably using the Calyrex more as an offensive support Pokemon, where you put your opponent in a position where they either need to get rid of a Calyrex because it's doing way too much damage with Astral Barrage, and in that case they would let you get a Calm Mind, or to stop you getting Calm Minds up, they just have to keep taking Astral Barrage. And Calyrex on these can run interesting support moves like Encore, Disable, and Will-O-Wisp to help support the Terrapagos. Lunala, Miraidon, it seems that a lot of these teams just tend to be standard Reg G Miraidon stuff, but with Lunala instead of Farigiraf, which I don't really get because I think the priority blocking is so important for that team, but some people seem to have made it work. And then we've got Lunadon, zero made day 2 usage. Seems like it's not worth using at this point in time. I just don't think that Groudon is a good enough restricted to make the most of Lunala's support. Now, obviously, in the past, Groudon was very good, but it just doesn't feel as good anymore. And as we look at the restricted usage, 0 Groudons made day 2, but over 50% of the day 2 teams had a Calyrex Shadow, which is kind of insane. I'm also really shocked at how low Calyrex Ice's usage was. Like, 6th for Calyrex Ice feels insane to me. But its usage did go up from day 1 to day 2, so there's probably a lot of potential there. And then we're looking at the other Pokemon. I'm not going to talk about all of these because that'll take forever. Interesting things to note is that Urshifu went up in usage quite a bit, as well as Rillaboom. But a very interesting thing I think is worth pointing out is Whimsicott usage went from 17.6% to 8%. Tornadus went down as well, about 4%. Grimmsnarl went down 6%. And Roaring Moon went from 4.6% to 0%. And the reason I think all of these Pokemon are interesting is because they all tend to use fast speed control options. We've got Tailwind, 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 and priority Thunderwave. And it just seems that a lot of the fast speed control options didn't really do that well. There was a good amount of really well performing teams that just didn't have fast speed control and didn't even have speed control at all, which I find really surprising in double restricted. I thought when you're facing 2 restricteds, speed control is going to be so important, but a lot of the teams that did well proved me wrong. But speaking of the teams that did well, let's talk about them. So in first place, Lorenzo winning with Calyrex Shadow, Zamazenta. So this was the restricted pairing that most people expected to be good going into this format, and it did end up winning, so it must be good. And Lorenzo's team was Calyrex Shadow, Zamazenta, Rillaboom, Incineroar, Urshifu, and Fire Ogerpon. This sort of comp was very popular on ladder before this tournament. I feel like I'd seen this a lot, usually with something over for Fire Ogerpon, like a Chien Pal, sometimes a Raging Bolt, sometimes a Tornadus. Some interesting things to note about this team is the Life Orb Calyrex Shadow, which I think is what we're going to be seeing a lot more of, just because you don't have to rely on Calyrex Shadow as much to win you games, so being able to just output as much damage feels better. The Incineroar being Terra Bug is something that I want to highlight a lot, because I think how a lot of people are going to be approaching this format is they want a Terra type on Incineroar that lets you resist fighting, but they don't want one like Ghost, which makes them weak to Astral Barrage, so Bug seems like a very good option. This Incineroar also has Helping Hand, so making this Calyrex even scarier, as well as working well with basically anything else on the team, as they all do a lot of damage. The Ogerpon has Grass Glide, adding extra priority, which is probably quite needed on this team as it has no speed control. So the winning team for the first regulation tournament had no speed control, which I think is a very important thing to take note of. And next we've got the second place team. This team really surprised me with how well it did. So we've got Sneasler, Calyrex Shadow, Dondozo, Tatsugiri, Chi-Yu, and Miraidon. Dondozo is something I did not expect to do well in Regulation I. Mainly because it feels very hard to bring, because when you bring Dondozo, you need to bring Tatsugiri. And then you've only got 2 slots left. Are you going to be bringing both restricteds? Probably not in a lot of matchups. So with this team, I imagine that Pearl didn't bring both restricteds to a lot of different games. But they've got a lot of very interesting things on the team. So it's Electric Seed, Unburden, Sneasler, but with Toxic Spikes. So the Toxic Spikes pairs very well with Dondozo. You just set up Toxic Spikes and then your really bulky Dondozo can just stall end games. But your Sneasler isn't just there for Toxic Spikes. It can threaten a lot of damage with Close Combat and Diaclaw threatens a lot more anyway, and Fake Out pairs very well with your 2 very powerful restricteds. We see the Assault Vest Miraidon instead of Specs, which was much more common on Dondozo comps in Reg G, so I'm not really surprised to see that. And we see Chi-Yu, which pairs very well with both of your restricteds. We also see that the Calyrex is Encore instead of something like Nasty Plot. I think that makes a lot of sense. This team doesn't really have time to set up a Nasty Plot, whereas being able to punish things for protecting, especially if you're going to be leading Sneasler so you can threaten Fake Out, is very nice. So a Sneasler Calyrex Shadow lead is really hard to lead into because you can't protect versus it, otherwise you might get encored. But there's honestly not too much to say about this. I think this is just like a 2-2-2 Dozo team, except all of these four kind of work really well together. The only combination I see from the non-Dozo mode that doesn't look that good is probably Chi-Yu Sneasler, but even then that doesn't seem bad. But Tatsugiri also being Sash Helping Hand I think makes a lot of sense. It means that you can bring Tatsugiri as a support without the Dondozo. I imagine that Pearl was quite often bringing Tatsu without Dondozo, but I would be very surprised if they ever brought Dondozo without Tatsugiri. And again we see Terra Dark on the Calyrex Shadow, which is the same that we saw on the first place team. And then moving on to the first top 4 team, we have a Miraidon Lunala team. Now Seawolf Mics actually tweeted out their paste, so this is their exact paste, which is very nice to see because it makes it a lot easier to figure out what they're trying to do with the team. So they went with Miraidon Lunala, with Whimsicott Chi-Yu, Rapid Strike Urshifu, and Iron Hands. So this looks very similar to like Arabega Miraidon stuff, but they've got a Lunala instead of Farigiraf, and they've got a Chi-Yu instead of the normal Ogerpon, but Chi-Yu was seen more than Ogerpon on the early versions of Miraidon, and when you've got a Lunala, I think having Chi-Yu makes a lot more sense. Chi-Yu is also way better into Calyrex Shadow, which as we saw, there was a lot of Calyrex Shadows. So a few interesting things to note about this team is Electricity Lunala, making it very bulky, especially into Incineroar. Like Incineroar would usually want to knock it off, but now it can't knock anything off, and the defense boost means you're really not doing that much damage. It's also Moongeist Beam, Psy Shock, Wide Guard, Trick Room. Wide Guard I think is very powerful. Trick Room gives you a Trick Room mode, which Miraidon teams tend to really like because of the Iron Hands, and then just double stabs to do as much damage as possible. The Miraidon on the team as well has very little bulk, which is very different to what we were seeing at the end of Reg G. We'd usually see a very bulky Miraidon, but I guess just going a lot faster, because a lot of the time faster Miraidon is better in the mirror. With this speed as well, you're probably outspeeding most Zamazentas you're facing. I think you'd have to be Jolly Zamazenta to outspeed this Miraidon, so that was probably really useful, as a lot of Zamazentas would expect to outspeed the bulkier Miraidons. And I also think it's worth noting the Iron Hands is min speed, making it work a lot better in Trick Room, but also very good into Calyrex Ice teams. Now in Reg G, most of the Iron Hands that did well were 0 speed as well, because that way into Calyrex Ice, if they set up Trick Room, your Iron Hands at worst speed ties with the Calyrex. And if it doesn't, then it will outspeed it, and you probably have the tools to be able to beat Calyrex outside of Trick Room, so you're fine with it not setting up Trick Room. Especially on a team like this, like you've got Miraidon, Lunala, Chi-Yu, and Urshifu, all of them are quite good into Calyrex. So that min speed there, probably just for the Calyrex matchup, but also makes your Trick Room mode a lot more powerful. But apart from that, it's fairly standard. Standard Chi-Yu, standard Whimsicott, and standard Sash Ursh instead of like a bulky Mystic Water one. And then we've got the other top 4 team, which is Calyrex Shadow, Zamazenta, Incineroar, Urshifu, Amoonguss, and Pelipper. So we're seeing Pelipper again, which is something I didn't expect to see many of this format, at least this early in the format, because if you want Rain, why would you not go Kyogre? But we're seeing Pelipper. Again, the very strong pairing of Calyrex Shadow and Zamazenta. This Calyrex is sashed instead of Life Orb, and it has Disable, which I think is a very interesting support move to have on it. Other interesting things to note are Life Orb Pelipper, which can do insane damage if you get it into position, but without speed control, I feel like it's very hard for it to get into position. So I wonder how useful the Life Orb actually was, or if the Pelipper was mainly just there for the rain, and for Wide Guard, double Wide Guard on this team as well. Then we see Mystic Water Urshifu with Taunt, which is fairly standard. Close combat is only really good into like Terrapagos and stuff, and a lot of people didn't expect Terrapagos to be that good. Amoonguss is fairly standard. Terra Dark, which I guess is very good into the Calyrex Shadows, but then it makes it weak to Body Press. It also makes it immune to Prankster, so if a team has like Taunt Tornadus, you can easily lead Amoonguss into it and just Terra to get around the taunt. But then it has Assault Vest and Incineroar with Terra Fairy. So we're seeing another Terra that lets it resist Body Press whilst also not being weak to Astral Barrage. But the Assault Vest I think is very interesting. I think that Knockoff and Flare Blitz are very good coverage in this format, as you're hitting Cali, Shadow, and Zamazenta for a lot of damage, but it's probably there just to take the special hits more. Most teams are going to have a Cali Shadow, so being able to take those Astral Barrages even better than an Incin usually would is very nice. Miraidon also exists, so I imagine this probably takes like a Electro Drift from it, which is very nice, or at least a Volt Switch. And then U-Turn can do okay chip damage, which On Cali Shadow teams, sometimes just a bit of chip is all you need to get a KO with Astral Barrage and just start sweeping. And then in 5th place, we saw Zacian Calyrex Shadow. Zacian Calyrex Shadow was the pairing that won the 2022 World Championships, but that was back when Zacian was the best restricted. So it's quite cool to see it doing well again. The Zacian set is sort of what you should expect. In Reg G, you probably wouldn't see Sacred Sword and Play Rough from the same one, but I think it makes a lot of sense now. Play Rough is probably Zacian's best move because fairy coverage is just so nice, but Sacred Sword is very nice for hitting stuff like Incineroar and to hit Zamazenta, getting around its defense boost. And we see this with Calyrex Shadow, but in Prison Calyrex Shadow, deciding that they wanted their support move to just be used to beat other Calyrex Shadow, and it seemed to work pretty well for them. Other interesting things to note, knockoff Incineroar I think is quite interesting. It means it can threaten Calyrex Shadow into Terroring, which is quite nice. And also it can get rid of items. I'm not sure what items it would want to get rid of in this format. Rocky Helmet on Amoonguss would be very nice, but Amoonguss isn't that popular and you've got Taunt on Ursh, so maybe like Life Orbs and stuff. It's also something you can't really switch into very well because if you switch into a knockoff, you're losing your item. We're seeing another Taunt Ursh without close combat, fairly standard Ogerpon, and Tornadus with Rain Dance, which is fairly standard, but it has Ability Shield. And usually we'd see Ability Shield on a team with a Weezing because Weezing will turn off everything else's ability, but you get to keep your own. But this team, not having a Weezing, only putting Ability Shield on the Tornadus for other Weezings. So clearly, this person was very concerned about Weezing, probably Weezing Miraidon, which is why they've got Ability Shield with Rain Dance, and decided they didn't need an item on their Tornadus otherwise. And it seemed to have worked well for them. So I wonder how many Weezing they actually faced, because it didn't seem like it was very popular, but if that's an auto loss otherwise, and now suddenly it's a good matchup with Ability Shield, maybe it's worth running. And then in 6th, we've got Marco's team, which is Calyrex Shadow, Terapagos, Rillaboom, Incineroar, Fire Ogerpon, and Water Urshifu. Now the interesting thing here is the combination of Calyrex Shadow and Terapagos, which was something that we didn't really expect to see much. A lot of people didn't think Terapagos was very good, but clearly it can still be used quite well as Marco got top 8 with it. The 4 other Pokemon they used were all very common partners with both Calyrex and Terapagos, so it makes a lot of sense that they work with both. We're seeing Vascular Fire Ogerpon do very well again, deciding that they don't need speed control, but sometimes probably need a bit more priority. So the team just probably functions by being able to let Calyrex or Terapagos set up, then do a lot of damage, and then if you get like a +2 Calyrex next to a Terapagos, they need to get rid of that Calyrex, letting your Terapagos Calm Mind. Another thing that I think is worth noting is the Terapagos isn't the subset anymore, it's Earth Power. With Zamazenta being very popular, I feel like Earth Power makes a lot of sense. It means your Terapagos can beat Zamazenta if you give it enough boosts or do enough damage to the Zamazenta, and because it's double restricted, you're not relying on Terapagos to win you games as much, so sub doesn't seem as needed. So yeah, this team just seems very solid. There's not too much to say, it's just fairly standard, but it's cool to see Calyrex Shadow Terapagos doing very well as a restricted pairing. And then in 7th, I really like this team with Calyrex Shadow and Koraidon. Like I said before, the theory with this restricted pairing is very similar to Zamazenta instead of Koraidon, but it threatens a lot more damage. Also, both restricted pair very well with Chi-Yu, Calyrex making the most of Beads of Ruin, and Koraidon giving it Sun to make Heat Waves even more powerful. We see Whimsicott for Tailwind on the team, but also has Helping Hand to make any of the Pokemon more powerful. Ditto is also a very powerful Pokemon in double restricted, because in matches you have 2 restricted you could transform into, whereas in Reg G you'd only have 1 restricted to choose to transform into. So in Reg I, Ditto has a lot more valuable targets for it to transform into, but also seeing Terra Normal is very interesting. This is just to make it immune to Astral Barrage, which I find very interesting on a Sash set. I would have thought Ghost would be better to get around Fake Outs, but also if you copy a Calyrex Shadow, you make it more powerful, but making yourself immune to Astral Barrage I think makes a lot of sense as well. And then there's Brute Bonnet, which is just sort of like Amoonguss, but in Sun, the Photosynthesis boost can give it a defense or a special defense boost, probably defense to make it a lot better into Calyrex's. It's also a bit faster than Amoonguss, but I think one of the main reasons to use it is Sucker Punch. Sucker Punch threatening something like opposing Calyrex Shadows, probably forcing them to have to Terra in the early game. But this team actually seems very anti-Calyrex Shadow. Like, you've got your own Calyrex Shadow, I guess it's Terra Ghost, so it's not that that good in the mirror if they have a defensive Terra type, but you have a Terra Normal Ditto, a Sucker Punch Root Bonnet, a Chi-Yu, a Terra Dark Whimsicott, and Koraidon, which can probably take a hit and then just one-shot it back. And then in 8th place, we have Miraidon, Grimmsnarl, Volcarona, Zamazenta, Ditto, and Iron Hands. This just looks like JoUX9's Reg G team, but instead of the Urshifu, it's a Zamazenta, which makes a lot of sense as a change. Some interesting things to note about this is the Volt Switch and Iron Hands instead of something like Low Kit, deciding it wants to be able to pivot more than it wants to be able to do a lot of damage that Low Kit gives it. But the Volcarona set, I think, is very interesting. The Quiver Dance set is what Joe ran, and that's not really what I'm surprised at. It's the two moves that they decided to run with it, with Fiery Dance and Struggle Bug. Now, I wouldn't be surprised if some people watching this don't actually know what either of these moves actually do. So Fiery Dance is a single target fire move with 80 base power, but has a 50% chance to raise its special attack. Meaning it's just a very strong stab move for Volcarona, but also has the chance to boost it even more, making it very hard to switch into, because even if you switch in something that resists fire, you might be giving your opponent a +1. But I also think they probably had Fiery Dance because of Zamazenta. All the Zamazentas are running Wide Guard, so having Heat Wave on Volcarona just doesn't seem as good anymore, because the main thing Volcarona probably wants to hit is Zamazenta, and Zamazenta can just block the Heat Wave. And then Struggle Bug is basically a bug type Snarl. So being able to use Volcarona to lower Pokemon's special attack. And I imagine after a Quiver Dance, that can really change some matchups. Like imagine you're facing a Miraidon Calyrex Shadow team. All you need is one Quiver Dance and suddenly you can always lower the special attack of your opponent's Calyrex Shadow and the Miraidon before they attack. Pairing that with something like Screens just seems insanely strong. So this Volcarona set, very weird, but I really like the look of it. The rest is fairly standard. That's a standard Miraidon. It's Screens, Grimmsnarl with Foul Play, makes sense. Behemoth Bash instead of Heavy Slam to hit things that Terra Fairy, Sash Ditto, and the Volt Switch I've already spoken about. And then in 9th place we have another Calyrex Zamazenta, fairly standard. In the flex slot they've got a Rain Dance Tornadus. Some interesting things to note on this team is this one's a Sashed Calyrex instead of the Life Orb that ended up winning, and it has Encore. And it's a Choppleberry Incineroar, which means into Zamazenta, you probably don't have to Terra. It can probably take the Body Slam quite well, meaning it can still keep the resistance to Astral Barrage. And as I'm saying that, I've realised that as one means that you can't eat the Choppleberry because it's unnerved. So Choppleberry, I guess, means it doesn't have to Terra versus Zamazenta, but if a Zamazenta's paired with Calyrex, they can just turn off the Choppleberry. So it seems like a very weird choice to me now that I've thought about it. Not much else on the team really stands out. Another Urshifu that's Taunt and not close combat, and another Tornadus that is Terra Dark. Terra Dark seems to be the most popular on Tornadus and Whimsicott. In 10th place we have Koraidon and Terapagos, which is quite an interesting restricted pairing. Now looking at this team, it looks very similar to the Terapagos Heatran teams that we saw at the end of Regulation G, but instead of Screamtail Heatran, it's Koraidon Fluttermane. Now the Heatran was basically only there to beat Koraidons and Zamazentas. Koraidon is very good into Zamazenta, and I guess with Fluttermane, it gives you a matchup into opposing Koraidons, because you can threaten Moonblast, forcing them to Terra, and then with Ogerpon, you can either cudgel them or you can Terra Blast them with Terapagos. We're seeing the Life Orb set on this Koraidon instead of the Clear Amulet that we usually see, but I think it makes a lot of sense. Other things to note is this Terapagos is also Earth Power instead of Sub, like how Marco ran it, and it's Sash Fluttermane because it doesn't really need booster energy when the sun's being set up for it a lot of the time. But apart from that, fairly standard Incin, but with Poison, again another typing that resists fighting but isn't weak to Ghost. Rillaboom is standard Terra Grass just for extra damage, and Rock Ogerpon. And then there's the only Calyrex Ice that ended up top cutting, paired with Miraidon. Now I think this team is interesting because it looks so much just like a Calyrex Ice team plus a Miraidon. I wouldn't be surprised to see this sort of team, but with a Raging Bolt over Miraidon and maybe like an Incin over Iron Hands. So it feels much more built around the Calyrex Ice. We're seeing a Pelipper do well as well, which I think is very interesting to see that there's 2 Pelippers in top cut. Meanwhile, there's 0 Kyogres. So maybe in this format, Pelipper just is the better rain setter. But all of the sets seem fairly standard. You've got your standard Miraidon just doing damage with choice specs, a Scarf Urshifu to make the most of rain very quickly, also with coaching to help boost Calyrex, but also Iron Hands and I guess Ogerpon. Standard Calyrex with Terra Fire. Standard Iron Hands. It's got Wild Charge instead of Heavy Slam, which I guess it doesn't really need Heavy Slam on this team. Heavy Slam is used a lot for Flutter main, which doesn't love facing this rain mode and also doesn't want to be brought against Calyrex. And it's also good at hitting Amoonguss, which Calyrex does very well, apart from if it Terras, but if it Terra Waters, it's now weak to Wild Charge. And you don't really have to worry too much about Amoonguss sporing you because you've got Miraidon. And then in 12th is the team that caught my eye the most. It's got Koraidon Calishadow with Smeargle. Now these are the main two we've been seeing do well with Smeargle in Reg G, so it makes sense that they both be with it here. But all of the sets seem fairly standard. It's interesting to note that this Smeargle has Wide Guard and Spiky Shield and no Fake Out. But the team has Rillaboom Incineroar, so I guess it doesn't need it. Again, we're seeing Incineroar have a Terra type that resists fighting, but is not weak to Ghost, which seems to be on all of the well-performing Incineroars. And we're seeing Flare Blitz on it instead of the usual Will-O-Wisp, but that makes a lot of sense with Koraidon because you get to do a lot of fire damage. So there's not really much to say about this team. It's just support the Calyrex to get a nasty plot and then sweep, or support the Koraidon to do a lot of damage, whilst also being able to do damage with a lot of your support with Incineroar, Rillaboom and Ogerpon. And Smeargle can just be a very hard Pokemon to deal with if you're not prepared for it. And then we see another Calyrex Shadow Terapagos, very similar to Marco's, but instead this one is a much more supporty Calyrex Shadow with Will-O-Wisp and Disable, deciding that they want to rely a lot more on the Terapagos with this version, as we're seeing it has substitutes. So this is way more similar to the Heatran Screamtail Terapagoses that we were seeing do well in Reg G. It's got 4 of the same Pokemon with basically the same sets, I think the exact same sets on them, but instead of Screamtail and Heatran we have Calyrex. But I think this Calyrex set kind of works the same as both the Heatran and as the Screamtail. It has Disable, which the Screamtail had, so being able to disable really valuable moves can help the Terapagos set up, but also Will-O-Wisp is very good into Zamazenta. You get a Will-O-Wisp into Zamazenta, suddenly it's not really that much of a worry anymore. This team actually has double Will-O-Wisp, which I think is very interesting. And by having the Calyrex Shadow almost act as both of those Pokemon, it lets you run something like Urshifu in the last slot. And the next team is very similar. Instead of the Urshifu, they've gone for a Flutter main. This one does have a Psychic move on Cali, but still has Will-O-Wisp like the other one does. This Terapagos also has Earth Power. Again, we're seeing a Terra type that resists fighting, but isn't weak to Ghost, which is something I feel like I've said so much for this video. But then there's this Flutter main, which I really like the look of it. So it's booster energy, but it doesn't have Icy Wind, it has Thunder Wave. Probably deciding that it wanted speed control that can work into basically anything, as Icy Wind doesn't work into things with Clear Amulet, but then the other moves it wanted were really important. Taunt is just an insanely good move, especially on this sort of comp, as you probably want to be switching off Wide Guards, but it also is very good into Amoonguss as you don't have the sub Terapagos. Moonblast is its best damaging move, and then there's Fake Tears, which I think is very interesting, and Fake Tears is something that people should be looking at a lot in this format, because you pair Fake Tears with 2 special restricteds, and it can make them so scary. Like leading Fluttermane and Calyrex probably wouldn't be that threatening, because it's a Sash Calyrex, it doesn't threaten too much damage, although it does threaten a good amount of damage. But suddenly, you Fake Tears and you Terra Ghost, and that is one-shotting basically anything it hits for neutral. Fake Tears probably means that Terapagos also doesn't rely on Calm Mind as much, meaning that it can threaten a lot more immediate damage when you're leading it with Fluttermane. So although this is very similar to the last team we looked at, I feel like this Fluttermane set really changes how it functions, and I really like the look of it. And then lastly, in 15th place, there is another Calyrex Ice in Top Cut, with a Miraidon again, but with Fire Ogerpon, Farigiraf, Iron Hands, and Iron Bundle. So this to me just looks like a fairly standard Miraidon, but with a Calyrex Ice put on it, which I think is very interesting, as the other Calyrex Ice we saw do well looked like a Calyrex Ice team with a Miraidon put on it. Again, it's fairly standard, so there's not much to talk about. The Iron Hands is Wild Charge, which we saw on the other one instead of Heavy Slam, but the Bundle I think is very interesting. Now, Bundle works very well with Miraidon being able to hit ground types and grass types for super effective damage, and obviously the Quark Drive works with the electric terrain that Miraidon sets up, but I find it very weird to have Bundle and Calyrex on the same team. But Ice is a very good offensive typing, but it makes a lot of sense. It's also interesting to see Hydro Pump on this bundle. I feel like when I've seen bundles in Reg G, they'd always drop Hydro Pump for Encore, but we're seeing Hydro Pump do well again. But apart from that, it's all fairly standard. Like these 5 I would never be surprised to see on a Miraidon team, and then it's just a Calyrex Ice instead of an Urshifu or a Whimsicott or a Lando, whatever you'd want that slot to be. And that's all of the top cut teams. I could talk about some of the other teams. There's some quite interesting things that did well, like this Landorus is Scarf Crunch, for example, which is quite cool. We see at 19th as well is the highest place in Kyogre, which I find insane, because I thought Kyogre was going to be one of the best restricteds, top 3 restricteds, but we see 0 in top cut. There was a Frostmoth that went 7-3 as well, which is very cool. There's a Calyrex Ice Lunala Hard Trick Room team, which I love to see. We see Tinglu Dondozo do well again, but there's not really anything in day 2 that stands out as a restricted pairing, in my opinion. But I feel like we'll see a lot more interesting restricted pairings as we go on with the format. But anyway, if you did enjoy this video, please like, comment, subscribe. It's free, and if you decide to, you can always unsubscribe later, but please don't. So, yeah.